January 22nd, 1879. The British Empire thought itself unstoppable. Its armies had crushed Napoleon, conquered India, and bent half the world to its will. But on this day, under the shadow of a lonely hill in Zululand, that illusion was about to be torn apart. The red-coated soldiers of Queen Victoria marched into camp at Isandlwana with supreme confidence. Their rifles gleamed, their cannons stood ready, and their commanders believed no African army could possibly stand against them. But hidden beyond the ridges, 20,000 Zulu warriors crouched in silence, waiting. By nightfall, almost every man in scarlet would be dead. This is not just a story of battle. It is the day an empire's arrogance met its match, when warriors with spears and shields annihilated one of the most modern armies on earth. This is the day the Zulus destroyed the British Empire's myth of invincibility, the Battle of Isandlwana. To really get why the Battle of Isandlwana sent such a shockwave across the globe, you first have to understand the British Empire in 1879. This was the peak of the Victorian era, an age of incredible power and prestige. The empire was a global colossus, a sprawling domain where the sun, quite literally, never set. Its navy ruled the waves, its economy dominated world trade, and its army, in those iconic redcoats, had spent a century projecting British power across every inhabited continent. This was a professional, battle-hardened force, equipped with the latest military hardware. Its soldiers were masters of volley fire, a disciplined and devastating tactic that had broken armies from Europe to India. In the minds of the men running the empire, the idea of a serious defeat at the hands of what they called a native force wasn't just unlikely, it was unthinkable. But in the vast landscape of southern Africa, the gears of a disastrous conflict were already turning, driven by one man's grand and dangerous ambition. That man was Sir Henry Bartle Frere, the British High Commissioner for South Africa. Frere was the classic imperial administrator, a man of immense ambition sent to the region with one major goal: to create a confederation of South Africa. The plan was to unite the various British colonies, Boer republics, and independent African kingdoms under a single, stable, British-controlled government. It was a neat plan on a map in London, but on the ground, it faced one massive obstacle. That obstacle was the Zulu Kingdom. Under its powerful king, Chetshwayo Kampande, the Zulu Kingdom was the most formidable indigenous state in southern Africa. Forged into a potent military machine decades earlier by the legendary Shaka Zulu, the Zulu Army, or Impi, was a disciplined and highly motivated force that could mobilize up to 35,000 warriors. Chetshwayo, who took the throne in 1872, was a shrewd and capable ruler. He understood the immense power of the British and actively tried to keep the peace and protect his people's independence. He engaged in diplomatic negotiations and tried to walk the tightrope of satisfying British demands while preserving his kingdom's sovereignty. But to Sir Bartle Frere, a powerful independent Zulu kingdom wasn't a neighbor to negotiate with. It was a threat to be neutralized. He saw the Zulu military system as a fundamental barrier to his confederation plans, a threat to the peace of the region that had to go. Frere believed in the imperial mission with an almost religious passion, and he was determined to provoke a war to get what he wanted, whether the government in London approved or not. So he started to manufacture a reason for war. He seized on a few minor border incidents, a Zulu chief's sons pursuing 2 runaway wives into British territory and the brief detainment of 2 Englishmen, and painted King Chetshwayo and the Zulus as aggressive savages threatening the British colony of Natal. It was a gross and deliberate lie. Cetshwayo had actually offered to pay a fine for the border incident, a clear diplomatic move that Frere just ignored. In December 1878, acting almost completely on his own, Frere made his move. He gave King Cetshwayo's representatives an ultimatum. The terms weren't for negotiation. They were a demand for unconditional surrender, designed to be impossible to accept. Frere demanded, among other things, that the Zulu king completely disband his army within 30 days, abandon the military system that was the bedrock of Zulu society, and accept a British official who would effectively rule his kingdom. For Cetshwayo, this wasn't just an insult. It was a death sentence for his kingdom. To agree would mean the end of Zulu independence. He tried to find a peaceful way out, but it was useless. Frere wasn't interested. When the deadline of January 11, 1879 passed, Frere had the excuse he'd so desperately engineered. He ordered the commander of British forces, Lieutenant General Frederick Thesiger, the second Baron Chelmsford, to invade Zululand. The war was on. The man tasked with fighting Frere's war was Lord Chelmsford. An experienced colonial soldier, Chelmsford was the picture of the overconfident Victorian general. He deeply believed in the technological and moral superiority of his army. He saw the Zulu warriors as brave but primitive fighters who would be no match for disciplined redcoats and their Martini Henry rifles. His main worry wasn't that the Zulus would fight and win, but that they would refuse to fight at all, melting away into the landscape and forcing him into a long, frustrating chase. The idea that a Zulu army would dare to face his column in a pitched battle seemed almost absurd. Chelmsford's invasion plan involved 3 separate columns of British troops marching into Zululand from different directions. The idea was to converge on the Zulu capital, Ulundi, surround the main Zulu impi, and force a decisive battle where British firepower would inevitably win. Chelmsford himself took command of the central and largest column, which crossed the Buffalo River at Rorke's Drift and began its slow march into the heart of the kingdom. The column's progress was slow, bogged down by January rains and the logistical nightmare of managing thousands of oxen and hundreds of heavy wagons. They marched just over 10 miles in 10 days. On January 20th, Chelmsford's column arrived at the foot of a rocky outcrop known as Isandlwana and set up a large, sprawling camp. And here, the first of several fatal mistakes was made. Standard British military doctrine called for the wagons to be formed into a defensive circle, or laager. But at Isandlwana, this crucial step was ignored. The camp was left open and unfortified. Lord Chelmsford, so sure that the Zulus would never dare to attack his main force, simply didn't see the need. His mind was elsewhere, focused on finding an enemy he profoundly underestimated. This arrogance, this failure to respect his opponent, had just set the stage for a catastrophe. With the invasion underway, the British expected a quick reaction from the Zulus, but the kingdom was silent. King Cetshwayo, forced into a war he didn't want, had gathered his main army, an impi oaks of over 20,000 warriors, near his capital of Ulundi. His initial strategy was defensive: lure the invaders deep into his territory, stretch their supply lines, and fight on ground of his own choosing. For the British, this silence created a false and dangerous sense of security. It reinforced Lord Chelmsford's belief that the Zulus were too timid to face his army. His frustration grew. On January 21st, the day before the battle, scouting parties began sending reports back to the Isandlwana camp. A patrol led by a Major Dartnell had spotted a sizable Zulu force miles away. This was the bait. It wasn't the main Zulu army, but a smaller force sent to lure the British into a trap. Chelmsford, desperate for a big fight, swallowed it whole. He was convinced this was the main Zulu army and his chance to finally crush them. This led him to make the single most catastrophic decision of the war. Early on the morning of January 22nd, Lord Chelmsford divided his forces. Believing the camp at Isandlwana was secure, he personally led more than half of his fighting men out to find and engage the Zulus that Dartnell had spotted. He left behind roughly 1,800 men, a mix of British regulars and African auxiliaries, to guard the sprawling, undefended camp. In command was Lieutenant Colonel Henry Pullane, a capable administrator, but an officer with no combat command experience. As Chelmsford marched his men further and further away, chasing a phantom, he was marching directly away from the real danger. The main Zulu army, having advanced with incredible speed and discipline, wasn't where Chelmsford thought it was. They had brilliantly outmaneuvered the British commander. While Chelmsford was off chasing a decoy, the entire 20,000-strong Imperium had moved with stealth and precision, hiding themselves in a deep valley just a few miles from the unsuspecting camp at Isandlwana. They were waiting, silent and unseen. Back at the camp, the morning of January 22nd passed with a relaxed, almost lazy confidence. Soldiers ate breakfast, cleaned their rifles, and went about their duties. Around 8 a.m., the first hints of trouble appeared. Mounted sentries spotted small groups of Zulus on the distant hills. Colonel Pullane received the reports, but believing the main Zulu army was miles away with Lord Chelmsford, didn't think much of it. Then, around 10:30 a.m., Colonel Anthony Durnford arrived from Rorke's Drift with reinforcements of about 500 men from the natal native contingent. Durnford was technically senior in rank to Pullane, which created some confusion over who was really in charge. But Durnford didn't plan on staying. Hearing about the Zulus on the plateau, he decided to take his mounted troops out to chase them off, further dividing the camp's defenders. Pullane agreed to support him if he got into trouble. It was Durnford's patrol that finally sprung the trap. As one of his troops chased a small party of Zulus, they rode over the crest of a ridge. And there, laid out before them, was a sight that must have frozen the blood in their veins. In the valley below, covering the ground like a living carpet, sat the entire main Zulu army. 20,000 warriors organized in their regiments, sitting in silent, terrifying stillness. A British officer who saw it described the moment with chilling simplicity. The Zulus were in thousands. We had dropped into the middle of them. The sudden appearance of Durnford's men forced the Zulus' hand. They hadn't planned to attack that day. It was the new moon, an inauspicious time for battle. But now discovered, they had no choice. With a low, humming sound like a vast swarm of bees, the warriors began to rise. The commanders gave the order. The silent valley erupted. The Zulu impi began to advance, not as a chaotic mob, but in a disciplined, rehearsed formation. One of Durnford's officers galloped frantically back towards the camp, shouting a warning that it was about to be attacked. Back at the camp, Colonel Pullane had just received a confusing order from Chelmsford to break camp and join him. As he was trying to figure that out, Durnford's desperate messenger arrived. The reality of the situation crashed down upon him. The camp was facing the full might of the Zulu army. Bugles blared, officers shouted, and the relaxed morning shattered. Pullane ordered his men into a long, thin firing line. The 6 companies of the 24th Regiment of Foot, hardened veterans, formed the backbone of this line. They were confident in their rifles and their discipline, but they were desperately outnumbered. Their line was stretched thin, and their camp had no defenses. They were a thin red line, standing in the open, about to face a tsunami of fury. The time was just before noon. As the Zulu impi surged forward, it deployed its legendary battle tactic, the Impondo Zenkomo, the horns of the buffalo. The main body, the chest, made of veteran warriors, would advance head-on to pin the enemy in place. At the same time, two flanking horns, made of younger, faster warriors, would race out to the left and right, trying to encircle the enemy, cut off their escape, and attack from all sides. From the British lines, the sight was both magnificent and terrifying. A vast, crescent-shaped mass of warriors, stretching for miles, flowed steadily towards them. The sun glinted off thousands of spear blades. The air filled with the rhythmic stamping of bare feet and a deep, guttural war cry. Colonel Pauline's men stood ready. The red-coated regulars of the 24th Regiment anchored the line, their Martini Henry rifles at the ready. These were breech-loading rifles, capable of firing 10 to 12 rounds a minute. On paper, their firepower was unstoppable. As the Zulu chest came within range, the British officers gave the order to fire. Volley after volley crashed out. The effect was horrific. The heavy bullets tore through the cowhide shields and into the packed Zulu ranks. Hundreds of warriors fell, but the impi didn't break. It didn't even falter. Showing a disciplined courage that stunned the British, the Zulus simply closed ranks over their fallen comrades and kept coming. A Zulu warrior later said, "Some of our men were shaken, but the leaders ran forward and shouted, 'Is it the Battle of the King?' Then on. They pressed forward into the storm of lead. For the first hour, the thin red line held. The rate of fire was so intense, it created a killing ground in front of the British position. The Zulu advance stalled. It seemed for a moment that British technology would triumph. But two critical factors were beginning to turn the tide. First, the horns were closing in. While the chest was being hammered, the swift-moving horns of the Zulu formation were racing across the plain, far beyond the ends of the British line. The horns swept around, unopposed, moving to get behind the camp and cut off the only escape route. The British were about to be completely surrounded. The second, and perhaps more critical factor, was ammunition. The legend says the British ran out of ammo because the screws on the supply boxes were too tight. The reality was more complex and rooted in rigid military bureaucracy. The main problem was distribution. Quartermasters behind the lines stubbornly stuck to peacetime rules, refusing to issue ammunition to anyone but the designated men from their own companies. Runners sent back from the front were turned away or forced to wait in queues while their comrades were running desperately low. The firing line was simply too far from the supply wagons to get resupplied effectively in the heat of battle. The rate of British fire began to drop off. This was the moment the Zulus had been waiting for. Seeing the fire diminish, they signaled the final charge. The warriors of the chest surged forward. At the same time, the horns closed in from the flanks and rear. The British line, now under pressure from three sides and short on ammunition, began to break. The battle dissolved from an ordered firefight into a series of desperate, chaotic, hand-to-hand struggles. This was the fighting the Zulus excelled at. They swarmed over the British positions, their short stabbing spears, the Ikalwa, proving devastatingly effective up close. Survivor accounts paint a picture of utter hell, the air filled with the screams of men and the clash of steel. Soldiers fought back-to-back with bayonets and rifle butts. Small groups formed doomed squares, fighting until they were overwhelmed. Colonel Durnford and his troopers, their ammunition gone, died together in a final, gallant stand. Then, at the height of the slaughter, a moment of eerie drama. At 2:29 p.m., a partial solar eclipse cast a strange, otherworldly gloom over the battlefield. The sun was visibly devoured by a dark shadow. For the Zulus, this was an electrifying sign of victory. The event would forever give the battle its Zulu name, Usuku lwezinyanga ezifile, the Day of the Dead Moon. Under this ghostly light, the last pockets of resistance were wiped out. The Zulus overran the hospital tents and swarmed through the wagons. The battle, from the first charge to the final moments, had lasted little more than 2 hours. It wasn't a battle, it was an annihilation. Of the British and colonial troops in the camp, over 1,300 were dead. The professional soldiers of the British Empire had been all but wiped out. Miles away, Lord Chelmsford and his column had spent the day on a wild goose chase. As the afternoon wore on, a deep sense of unease began to settle over him. Faint sounds of battle had been heard, but were dismissed. Finally, around 3:30 p.m., a rider who had miraculously escaped the camp reached Chelmsford with the unbelievable news. The general was staggered. His reported response was one of pure disbelief. "But I left over 1,000 men to guard the camp." He immediately ordered his column to turn back. What greeted them at sunset was a scene of apocalyptic devastation. A heavy, deathly silence hung over the valley. The ground was a carpet of bodies. One survivor described it as a charnel house. Over 1,300 of their comrades lay dead, many ritually disemboweled, a Zulu practice to release the spirits of the dead. The bodies of men and animals were mixed with smashed wagons and looted supplies. There was evidence of desperate last stands everywhere. Clusters of red-coated soldiers lying in heaps where they had fought back to back, surrounded by the bodies of the Zulu warriors they had taken with them. The sight was so demoralizing that Chelmsford ordered his men to leave before sunrise, forbidding them from looking too closely for fear it would break their spirit. In the distance, a faint glow lit the sky. The mission station at Rorke's Drift was burning. The scale of the defeat was unprecedented. It remains the single worst defeat ever inflicted on the British Army by an indigenous force with inferior technology. An entire battalion of veteran infantry, the 1st 24th Foot, had been effectively wiped off the map. 52 British officers were killed, more than at the Battle of Waterloo. When news of Isandlwana reached London, it was met with stunned disbelief and national outrage. The public couldn't comprehend how their invincible army could have been destroyed by what they considered a backward tribe. The press howled for accountability. The defeat became a major political crisis for Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli's government and was a contributing factor to its fall from power in the 1880 election. Sir Bartle Frere was officially censured. Lord Chelmsford's career was shattered, and orders were sent to replace him. For the Zulu Kingdom, the victory was a moment of supreme triumph, a testament to their discipline, tactics, and spirit. They had done the impossible, but their victory, as monumental as it was tragically hollow. It didn't convince the British to negotiate for peace. Instead, it sealed the Zulu Kingdom's fate. The defeat at Isandlwana had wounded the pride of the British Empire, and the empire would have its revenge. Massive reinforcements were sent to South Africa. Eager to redeem his reputation before his replacement could arrive, Lord Chelmsford launched a second, much larger and more cautious invasion. This time, they took no chances, building fortified camps at every stop. King Cetshwayo, knowing his warriors couldn't repeat the miracle of Isandlwana, sent envoys to negotiate, but Chelmsford ignored them. On July 4, 1879, the reinforced British Army finally cornered the main Zulu force at the capital, Ulundi. The British formed a massive hollow square, bristling with rifles and Gatling guns. The Zulus charged with their usual bravery, but against an unbreakable formation with overwhelming firepower, they stood no chance. The Zulu army was shattered. Shortly after, King Cetshwayo was captured. The British dismantled his kingdom, dividing it into 13 chiefdoms, which deliberately sparked a devastating civil war. In 1887, what remained of the once proud Zulu Kingdom was formally annexed by the British. The Day of the Dead Moon was a stunning victory that ultimately led to the destruction of the very nation that won it. But the legacy of Isandlwana endures. It stands as a powerful symbol of resistance against colonial aggression, a battle that shattered the myth of European invincibility and forced a powerful empire to confront its own arrogance. It's a timeless story of how, on one fateful day, an army of warriors armed with iron spears and cowhide shields brought the most powerful empire on earth to its knees. The Anglo-Zulu War is filled with incredible stories. On the very same day the camp at Isandlwana fell, a tiny garrison at Rorke's Drift fought off a massive Zulu force in one of history's most famous last stands. If you'd like to see a video on that incredible story, let us know in the comments. And if you found this journey into history compelling, please consider subscribing for more stories like this one. The hill of Isandlwana is quiet now. The wind whispers through the tall grass where thousands once fought and died. White stone cairns dot the landscape, marking the mass graves of the British soldiers who fell here. It is a silent, haunting monument to a day that shook an empire. The story of Isandlwana is more than just a battle. It's a stark reminder of the human cost of ambition, the danger of underestimating an opponent, and the incredible courage that can be reached in the defense of a homeland. Thank you for watching.